Hi there, Joanna. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I know you've been busy. Maybe you'd like to start just by introducing yourself, telling us what research group you're in and what you're doing here and where you studied before you came here.
Yeah, hello, Ben. Thanks for having me today. So currently I'm a postdoc in Václav Tremel's group here in Prague, and how everything came to that was, so I studied geography in Hamburg, and I think that was why, the reason why I studied geography was that I was interested in several subjects when I was at school. And I was particularly interested in climate and climate change and ecology, but also in cultural aspects or social aspects like migration and languages. And I thought that geography would be probably the topic or the subject that would, where I could follow most of my interests. And so I studied geography. It was both human and physical geography. And but after a few months, I realized that I was mainly interested in physical geography, and I had a favorite professor who did ecology in the Himalayas, and I found that very fascinating. And so I mostly followed lectures with him, and then after a few years, I started to work as a student assistant in his group, because I wanted to see how life of a scientist looks like, and just wanted to learn more about what they are doing and what he was doing. And that was really, really great, even though it was sometimes, of course, these students' jobs are sometimes not the most interesting ones, but still it was, I learned much more about what they did. And that was how I developed, I think I really had a strong wish then to do a field work-based thesis. And I wanted to do it in the Himalayas. I absolutely wanted to do that. And together with my this favorite professor, who then became the supervisor of my thesis, we selected a site in Nepal, and I analyzed the dynamics of the upper tree line there of one valley. That means we went there, and I analyzed vegetation and soil patterns along elevational gradients at a tree line. And this is also where I heard for the first time that you can use tree rings to reconstruct past climate. So what I did in my undergraduate studies was to also see whether this tree line, so why we all did that was to see whether the tree line moves up or down. We also investigated, for example, juvenile growth, and counted the number of seedlings to see whether the tree line is advancing or not. And you can also use tree rings to study the growth response of trees to climate. And this is what I then did in my PhD. I went to Greifswald, which is in northeastern Germany at the Baltic Sea. And I used tree rings to study the growth response of trees to climate. So basically how you do that is that trees in such harsh environments, they usually grow better in years when the conditions are better, so when it's warmer, and they grow less when it's colder. And so you can go and measure these tree rings, and you get a series, and you can relate that to climate. And then you can even reconstruct climatic conditions beyond the times where you have, for example, meteorological records. On the one hand, it can be quite tedious to measure these tree rings, but it's super interesting what these tree rings can tell you. And then after a while during my PhD, I went a bit deeper into the topic, and I went on to study wood anatomy, which means that I not only looked at the ring widths, but also at the cells within one tree ring. And you can also measure these, and for example, cells can be larger or smaller, or they can have thicker walls or thinner walls. And this also tells you a lot about climatic conditions. And the resolution of this information is super high. So you can, for example, identify a spring drought event or early frost event or something like that by looking at these cells. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Well, thank you. It's a great roundup of everything. So I guess all your work is focused around tree lines, and the motivation is then, I guess, looking at past climatic changes. Maybe you could expand a bit on the sort of main reasoning for the research and maybe the timescales that you look at with these tree rings.
Yeah, it's true. I've always worked with tree lines. So in my master's, I've worked with elevational tree lines. Then during my PhD, I have looked at northern tree lines, so the tree lines towards the tundra. And with this dendrochronological work, we looked at time scales of about 100 years, simply because this is also the time period where we have meteorological records. And of course, you can, if you really go into the climate reconstruction, you can go several of thousands of years back, but that was not our aim. Since I was in the ecology department, the main aim was to understand the functioning of trees. So what really happens in the tree when it is warmer or when there is drought or things like that. And so the main motivation of my PhD and also during my current work is that, so the general assumption is that trees are limited by temperature at tree lines and they just don't grow higher or further north because it's too cold. And in general, this is also true, but it's much more complex. And and several studies have shown, including, I have also done a small study on that during my PhD, that there can also be a water limited growth at tree lines, especially, for example, in Alaska. There are very low annual precipitation sums, and it's not that rare that water availability limits tree growth to an equal amount as temperature. And there are even discussions about that. So forest does not expand, but that it retreats, so the boreal forest, and that there is a tree dieback. And this is really important to know about because the forest is such a huge biome, and if there are big changes going on and forest stores such a big amount of carbon, and with the huge distribution, they are so important for global circulation patterns like water cycles and climatic circulations. And it's really important to know what these trees do on a large scale.
Okay, and how does that relate then to the work you're doing here? Is it very similar, or has the motivation changed? Is it more of a geographical focus here?
Yeah, so I think now I'm going a step further than what compared to what I've done during my PhD, because now I'm using a model of tree growth. Before I have done, let's say, simple statistical analysis, and now I'm trying to use a model that models tree growth at the cell level. And with that, we would like to find out so we want to determine the exact proportion of tree growth that is limited by temperature and tree growth that is limited by moisture. So for example, we will, at the end, we will be able to say that, for example, on the 15th of July of 1965, tree growth at a specific site was limited by temperature to, 70%, and by an additional 20%, it was limited by water availability. And for the rest, the remaining 10%, we don't know. And we will get this information for every day and every year. And we include several sites. So now I'm combining elevational tree lines and northern tree lines to see whether there is also some spatial pattern if we look at it at the global scale. And for example, we have a site here in the Czech Krkonoše Mountains, and we have sites in Finland, in Russia, and in Canada, and we plan to also add data from the Rocky Mountains and the Himalayas. Yeah.
Thanks. I think that's a great roundup of kind of what you do and the motivation behind it. maybe like to move now and ask about what your sort of day look like and how this work looks in reality. So when you come into the office and when you're working at your desk, what is your kind of standard practice? What do you have to do to undertake this work?
Yeah, so currently I'm doing mostly data analysis, so this modeling, which means I use different kind of softwares to format my data, so to put the data that I get from other researchers or my own data into the correct shape that I can use them to check them for, I don't know, some unlogical values or something. And then I use the models to try and calculate this tree growth. And so this is what I mostly do at the moment. In the past weeks, I've also been busy with preparing proposals to get more funding to continue this work, because we think we can answer maybe much bigger questions if we can include more sites and more data. And that was mainly writing. So like putting down an idea of what we want to do with the reasons why we would like to do that, and a research plan how we would like to do that, and how much money we need for that, and so on. And then of course there is these daily things like emails, writing emails, and being in touch with other researchers, because we, in order to compile this big data set, we are in touch with a lot of international researchers, and we invite them for collaboration, which means they provide us their data, and we use them in our models, and we also discuss with them details about their data, because they know best their sites. And that's very, very interesting as well, to meet with all these people. I mean, meet online.
Yeah. I guess it's impossible to meet properly now. But maybe you could tell us then, it's a nice time to tell us about your own data, the data you've collected, maybe what you do in the field when you go to collect samples, and sort of where it's taken you. You already mentioned Nepal, but I know there's plenty of other places you've been, even here in Czechia.
So in the past, I've been, maybe the biggest field work that I've done was in Nepal for my master's thesis. That was really fascinating, because that was at elevational tree line in the Himalayas, which is at 4,000 meters. So that was a quite remote place. I had to travel there by bus on a gravel road and then hike several days there. And it was monsoon season, because as I did a vegetation analysis, it was necessary to see the flowers in order to be able to see which plant it is. And then maybe for my PhD, I did also a lot of field work at Northern Tree Line. Maybe the most interesting one was in Alaska, which was also a very remote site. There are not many roads, so we had to fly in there with a small plane, and then we collected samples, and we paddled down a river several kilometers and collected samples again, and so on. And for my current work, I don't do, or for my current project here, I don't do a lot of field work, because it's super time consuming, first of all. And so my project was only limited to a certain amount of time when I started here. So we thought it's most efficient to mainly collect what is already there. So I'm using some of the data that I have used previously. And also Václav has a lot of data that I can use. And but what we regularly do here in Czech Republic is to go to Krkonoše Mountains to monitor how the trees grow. And so when they start growing, that means we or somebody else, so we have contacts to local people there. So basically someone has to go there once per week during the growing season, which means from April to October, and take microcores. These are very, very small cores of maybe 1 or 2 millimeters diameter and maybe 1 centimeter length. And when you prepare them, that means when you do prepare thin sections, you can exactly see which cells have already been built, or whether there have been any cells built at all, and in which stage they are, whether they are enlarging or whether they are already dividing, or whether there is already a cell wall building up. And yeah, that's very interesting. And this part is also new for me. So this part of this kind of monitoring, very close monitoring. Yeah, and so I will use this kind of data to validate the model.
Yeah, and that, when you go, is it always checking the same tree or different trees in the same area?
Yeah, so we have a selection of several trees, and we always check the same trees because there might be differences between trees, and so during one growing season it makes sense. But after 2 or 3 years or so, you should change the tree, because there might be a small effect on growth by this. So it doesn't have a big impact on tree growth, but if you really want to look at the cells, there might be something visible from this sampling. So it's better to take a fresh tree, let's say, every 2 years or so. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess since you're applying for grants to stay here, you clearly must enjoy it here. Maybe you could compare how the move has been, compare the department here to maybe the universities in Germany you were at, and the city in general. Maybe tell us something about what you like about here.
Yeah, it's true. I like it here, and it's a very beautiful city with a nice historical town, and that was also one reason why I wanted to come here. So work is not everything, and I mean, I've been used to living in a big city from Hamburg, where I grew up and where I did my master studies. But then for my PhD, I have lived in a smaller town of about 50,000 inhabitants. And so it was quite a change to then come back to a bigger city. And everything is so lively here. And but I really enjoy it. And what I particularly like about Prague, or maybe Czech Republic in general, I have the impression that a lot of people are super active with outdoor sports. So whenever you go to a park, and whatever weather it is, there are people running and cycling and climbing or doing any kind of exercise. And in winter, everyone is crazy about skiing. And and it's not only what you see in town, it's also among the colleagues. I think you can confirm that. And I really enjoy this, to be in such an
like an active community.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. And I think the final thing I wanted to ask now was just in general about the work in academia. Maybe you could tell us what for you makes academia special, what you enjoy about working in research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I enjoy most is that that it covers such a broad range of fields or of tasks. So as I already said, so first you conceptualize your study. So you think about what research question you would like to answer and how you could answer that. Then you go to the field, collect the samples, and maybe you get some new ideas in the field, or realize that something doesn't work out as you have imagined that. And then you go back to the lab and you do some technical work. So we then particularly, we sand. So if we take a tree core, we sand the wood, or if we do wood anatomy, then we use a microtome to cut thin sections from that. And then there is also the measurement stage. So measurement of all the samples. Of course, we also get help from technicians or students, because it can be very time consuming, but I also like to do it, parts of it on my own, because it's really interesting to see the samples. And sometimes I get ideas for analysis when I analyze or when I measure the samples. And then there is the statistical analysis, which I also enjoy a lot, because it can be also a very creative part to think, how can I maybe subset the sample, or how can I approach my question best, or how can I program my research question so that the the software returns the information that I want to have. And then I also enjoy the writing part. So it can be sometimes difficult to first put up the story, but once it is there, I really enjoy to work on details of the text and to see how I can put the words so that it sounds nice. And yeah, so it's basically you have your own project and you're the project leader of your project, and it's also quite independent work. So you usually don't have people who tell you all the time what to do. Then I also like that it's so at least in our field, it's very common to have international collaborations, and of course this network grows over the time, and so it feels like being part of a big family. And so I enjoy that.
Brilliant. So that was all that I wanted to ask. So I just want to say thank you for joining and telling us all about your research.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. It was very nice.